Hey there, it's Syama Maher, CEO of Scaling Retail, and today I want to talk a little bit about some of the amazing fashion IPOs that you've likely been hearing about, right? In our industry, it's not often that we used to hear about companies that were going public, but we've actually been able to see recently the IPO of Warby Parker, Rent the Runway, and Allbirds. Pretty impressive, if you would say, right? In terms of how we're looking at where the future of direct-to-consumer companies are moving towards, and ultimately where we actually see the future of fashion. Now, one thing I think is really fascinating between these three different companies is we look at kind of where they've innovated in their respective spaces, right? Companies like Allbirds are really known for their sustainability, and they're known for really taking that to the mass market. Something that I have to say, not a lot of us thought would be possible in terms of reaching that mass market customer distribution, seeing investors also heavily back into and believe into sustainability. And then ultimately the Allbirds strategy, which is certainly going from direct to consumer from a e-com standpoint to brick and mortar locations. Definitely something that I think is really fascinating and something that we've actually been modeling here at Scaling Retail as we're advising and consulting clients along the way. The other thing that's really amazing with the Allbirds assortment plan is they stayed really true and core to their customer audience, growing incrementally, right? Not necessarily going after so many products at once, but really honing in on something that had a very unique customer market fit. So from that perspective, congratulations, Allbirds. From the perspective of what this means for future IPOs and sustainable businesses, something to really pay close attention to, right? How do you create a product market fit of something that is going to be great for the planet, something that's going to have great profitability, and also something that has the scalability to be able to reach mass market. Now, what does the future for Allbirds hold? I'm not so sure, right? When you start to peel back the onion layers and you look at how well the mechanics of these businesses are running, then you get into a very different perspective. Obviously, an IPO doesn't mean that the business is actually very healthy, right? We've seen lots of products and lots of services hit the market. Uber is a very famous example where actually not a profitable business, but valuation super high, right? IPO'd at a fantastic number and has continued to see really great fluctuations in terms of how their company is providing services in the market and how they've been expanding, but not necessarily healthy from a traditional P&L standpoint. And that I think is a really important distinction as we look at building businesses, right, that we maybe want to have long-term, that we want to grow, that we want to be healthy versus businesses that we want to pump resources into, grow really quickly, IPO and expand, but aren't necessarily financially healthy. Are these bad things? Not necessarily, right? IPOs historically this year, what I've been noticing are really happening in order to get early investors back their resources and back their money. So whether or not it's the right time for a company to IPO is one question. But what I can absolutely tell you is that it is getting those first investors back their resources and ultimately is showing, I believe, to the market really kind of a strong momentum around brands that are espousing these sorts of values. Now, the next company is obviously Rent the Runway. Love Rent the Runway. Obviously, a huge disruptor in terms of how we look at this entire market of consumption. I would actually say, as they've started to get better at looking at their carbon footprint, obviously their brick and mortar representation, how they've been changing up their business model. The idea of renting clothes was one of the very first disruptors as we actually looked at how we were going to create a better consumption narrative for consumers. And what I love so much about the Rent the Runway model is really that ability to not have to own goods, right? If you ask anyone in sustainability, what is the most sustainable thing you can do? It's to not make anything, right? It's to not buy anything. It's to work from what exists. Now, certainly Rent the Runway carries current collections and products that are currently available in different retail stores. But that idea of not having to hang on to something for forever, I think plays a really large role in how consumers think about their own evolving wardrobes and lifestyles. Now, let's not fail to mention here that Rent the Runway also IPO'd with an all-female executive team from the CMO to the CEO. What I think is amazing about having this female executive team is, again, it's showing leadership coming up in a really minority sector when it comes to looking at companies that traditionally IPO. So yay, go women in this space. Really excited for that. But again, as we look at how that company is actually performing on the books, right? What is actually happening from a supply chain issue, right? What is actually happening year over year? Numbers aren't necessarily healthy from that perspective, yet these early investors were able to cash out. Later investors lost resources on this because certainly the latest share prices that were transacting on that before it IPO'd were much higher, right? People had a much higher impression of what it could do. So falling short on the market, gaining from an early investor standpoint, and obviously a major win for women-led businesses that are looking to IPO and looking to grow within the fashion space. But Rent the Runway is really a tech play, right? Which I think is really fantastic. So Allbirds, sustainability play, Rent the Runway, a really great tech play, and also a new disruptive innovation in terms of how we look at consumption. The last company I think is very interesting is Warby Parker. Now, Warby Parker has often been mentioned by me, I would say, in the last 10 years in terms of business models that I thought were really innovative, a brand that actually did very well in terms of standing for something, both externally, right, in terms of really the next one alongside Tom's to adopt these kinds of models that gave back to communities, right, through product. Which I thought was fantastic. Warby also had the introduction of their brick and mortar locations, really great in terms of collaborations with other retailers. And again, I would say first to market and kind of proving this direct to consumer model, which I think is really valuable. Now, they could have gone the other route of a company like Bonobos in terms of being acquired, another early stage company in the market that was super innovative in their space, but they actually chose to IPO, which I think was pretty fantastic. So guys, as you're looking at these different companies in these spaces and you're wondering, what does the future of my business model look like? I think it's very important to understand how big you want the business to go. What are these key differentiators that you have? What does your leadership team look like in terms of how well poised you are? And how much capital and debt are you willing to take on in order to reach these bigger milestones? It's one thing to say, I want to disrupt $1 billion market. I want to go after that big valuation. It's another thing to say, hey, I want to build a business slowly, I want to scale it up profitably, and I want to keep it in the family for 25 years. Both of these options I think are extremely valuable, but they're going to take very different paths, right? And I think it's very important to understand what those paths are and how you rightfully set up those ecosystems and sequencing of funding, of growing, and of hiring in order to satisfy that. All right, guys, that's all for me over here at Scaling Retail. If you're interested in having a co-CEO by your side as you're helping to make critical decisions about how your business should be set up, how it should grow, how it should scale, please send us an email at hello@scalingretail.com. Would love to be able to help you make those key decisions so you too can see your business either through an acquisition, through long-term family planning, or through an IPO reach those heights of success. All right, I'll talk to you soon. Bye.